Hey, this is Dr. L, and this video lecture is going to be about answering the question, what happens to toxins at an introductory level. We're going to talk about the fate, degradation, bioaccumulation, and biomagnification of toxins and why this matters. And we're going to use examples that are relevant to war and terrorism to align with some earlier lessons that we've already covered in this course. So we're going to talk about what we mean when we refer to the fate of a toxin. We're going to talk about how toxins can be degraded. We're going to define the terms bioaccumulation and biomagnification, which means talking about a property called being lipophilic and a couple of others. We're going to talk about half-lives, and we're going to compare and contrast two pairs of chemicals with regards to their fate. And those chemical examples are taken from, warfare and terrorism. So when we are talking about the question, what happens to toxins, right? One thing I want you to think about is what happens to toxins in the body, right? So the toxicokinetics or toxicopharmacology is about describing what happens to a toxin or any other chemical once it's in the body. Like, where does it go? And what happens to it, and how long does it last there, and what effects does it have? And so this is a slide taken from a paper about toxins that are associated with marine microbiota, so toxic sea blooms, toxic freshwater blooms from dinoflagellates and other marine microscopic life forms, things like cyanobacteria. And so some of them are neurotoxic. In order to be neurotoxic, they would have to get to the brain. Some of them are toxic to the GI tract, which means they would have to get to the GI tract. Some of them affect the immune system, some the liver, and typically that means the toxin is moved to the liver and may be getting metabolized or altered in the liver, possibly even to something more dangerous than what it was to begin with. And some cause skin toxicity. So this could be because that's where the toxin touches, but it could also be that if the toxin is taken in, it mobilizes to the skin. It just depends, right? So figures like this show us that different toxins will partition to and impact different parts of the human body, and this would be true in plants or in non-human animals. More broadly, when we talk about the fate of a toxin, right? So this slide is some of what you need to know to answer the question, what is the fate of a toxin inside the human body? And then we could ask the question, what is the fate of a toxin out in the broader environment, right? So will it enter animals, plants? What will it do with microbiota? Will it stick in the soil, or will it pass through the soil? Will it dissolve into the water, or will it not dissolve into the water? Will it go to sediments? Will it move into the air or the atmosphere? And how long will it last, right? And so this is an old picture from the Vietnam War era, and those planes are spraying something called Agent Orange, which was an herbicide. It was used to defoliate, to clear the landscape of vegetation so that there was a clearer view for the on-the-ground warfare that was happening at the time. And we'll touch on this a little bit more later on, but Agent Orange is incredibly toxic. And so there's a lot of concern about the fate of the chemicals that were in Agent Orange in Vietnam and in other places where it was used. Pictures like this is a photo or a slide or figure or model taken from the U.S. EPA, website Environmental Protection Agency. What the EPA does, they do many things, but one of the things they do is model and study the fate of toxins in the environment. And they put together figures like this to help us understand that the fate of toxins in the environment can involve a lot of different things, right? So here we've got toxins that are being emitted as vapors or particles from some kind of source, right? They could be taken up by the leaves in some cases. They could be dispersed in air currents traveling, across the planet to other places. When rainfall occurs, you could have what is called atmospheric deposition. That atmospheric deposition will get that material into the water. And so any creature consuming the water might be exposed to it. You can have contaminants settle down into the sediment where they get taken up by what are called benthic, or deep water, like at the sediment level organisms. And then they could transfer up the food web, right? And then anything that's eating the food web, like eating the fish here, it's going to move into that, which is something called trophic transfer, when toxins move through food webs from one trophic level to the next. So there's quite a lot to the fate of contaminants. So broadly, what can happen to a chemical in any environment? It could be degraded, which means it could be partially changed, or it could be completely changed into something harmless, right? And not all toxins can be completely changed into toxins. So some might just be transformed from one form to another. So for example, arsenic is an element, so it could be transformed from one chemical form to another, but the arsenic will always persist, right? It's not gonna, you can't make it disappear or go away. You could just change it from one form to another. In contrast, the chemicals that are found in petroleum, most of them are hydrocarbons, and under the right conditions, they could be completely degraded to CO2 and water. So there's something harmless that comes out of it, and that would be complete degradation, sometimes called mineralization. To be transformed really kind of fits into this degraded category, but the word often gets used separately. It means changed from one form to another, or they could be also moved or dispersed, or they could be stored. These are kind of like the four major things that can happen to chemicals in any given environment, and globally too. So degradation can be of three varieties. It could be physical, chemical, or biological. Physical degradation means that physical forces are acting on the toxin, and they're affecting or impacting its fate. So you could have a chemical that's a toxin and it might evaporate or volatilize, meaning it goes from a liquid or a solid into a gas stage, and then that's going to allow it to move, right? So it will affect its fate. You could disperse it, which some people might consider to be a form of degradation because it reduces the effective concentration where you are at, right, or where you're studying. It could be absorbed or stick onto soil particles, right? Chemical transformations are chemical reactions in the absence of any biological entity. So it's not metabolism, it's just purely chemical. So hydrolysis means reactions with water, photodegradation, reactions with ultraviolet light, and oxidation reactions, things like reacting with free radicals or ozone, or many different other chemicals can act oxidatively to change a chemical through reaction. Biological degradation means degradation that is done through metabolism. So some living thing is metabolizing the toxin and changing it, right? So those living things could be microbes, they could be plants, they could be animals. Usually when we think about this, we think about microbial degradation, but plants are also really important in the transformation or changes of chemicals in the environment. All right, so here's an example, a little bit of an example. Benzoapyrene, which is the toxic chemical that is found, or one of the many toxic chemicals that is found in cigarette smoke, right? There are like hundreds of chemicals in cigarette smoke. This is a particularly nasty one. It's cancer causing. So this is a really dangerous chemical. It falls into a group called polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And all of those chemicals have these ring-shaped structures. So when you take benzoapyrene into your body, what will happen primarily in your liver, but also in other tissues, is that the benzoapyrene itself is not what's causing cancer. It's the fact that the benzoapyrene is converted using a class of enzyme called cytochrome P450s into a couple of metabolic intermediates, ultimately resulting in an epoxide form. This epoxide shown here is highly reactive, and what it will do is it will bind DNA. It'll form something called a DNA adduct, and that will induce mutations, and it will induce a lot of mutations, and cumulatively they will give rise to cancer, or they can give rise to cancer. So this is actually a bioactivation, where you have the chemical changed from something in one form into something that is more toxic. And it doesn't always happen, but it happens with benzoate pyrene in creatures like humans. In the environment, benzoate pyrene will tend to, if it's in the atmosphere, it'll react with water molecules, and then it will react with UV light and some of the free radicals that are found in the atmosphere. It can actually be fully degraded eventually in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, if it was in the sediment, it will persist for like hundreds of years because there is no UV light and there are less oxidizing chemicals there. All right, so storage of an environmental chemical. There's a couple of ways to think about that. So you might see chemicals that are binding very firmly to soil or sediment, and they're just going to stay there, right? So there are contaminated sediments all over the world that if you go down and you sample them, you can find contaminants that are stored in that sediment, like from hundreds of years ago, from the Industrial Revolution era. And they're never going to go away unless we remove those sediments and actively do something to them. So that's one sort of way that chemicals can be stored in the environment. And not all chemicals will do that, just some. Another way to think about storage is maybe a little bit more temporary, but some chemicals are particularly fat-loving or lipophilic. And so they don't like water. Instead, they like fat. And so what they will do is they will partition or move preferentially into fat away from water. So if you were to take one of those lipophilic chemicals and drop it in a glass that had water and oil, that chemical would be found at high concentration in the oil phase, and hardly any of it would be in the water phase. And this is in contrast to chemicals that are not lipophilic, and we call those chemicals polar, and they would avoid the oil and they would move into the water. And that's a chemical property, whether you're polar or non-polar, lipophilic or non-lipophilic. If you're polar, you're non-lipophilic, and vice versa. Now, when you think about the human body, and I apologize, this slide is like, that picture's like a little bit gross, right? But we have fat everywhere in our bodies. So breast tissue, fat lining all of our organs, fats in tissues like the pads of our fingers, and basically our brains are entirely fat, right? So they are like the oil in this glass of oil and water. If you take a lipophilic chemical in, it is going to partition into the fatty tissue, and it's not going to be excreted in your urine, right? And it might actually hang out there and stay within the body, okay? Another example of a chemical getting stored in the body, and this is not in fatty tissue, but it's still worth noting here, is lead. If you're exposed to lead, what will happen is the lead will actually ultimately end up in your bones, especially if you're a young person, and it will just be stored in the bones for as long as those bones last. Okay, so moving along, next I'm going to talk about the terms bioaccumulation and biomagnification. I'm going to start that in another video so this one doesn't get too long.